Okay. All right. All right. Raise your hand if you can hear me. Cool. Now remember, it's important that you take notes during the video. You won't need that. No, you won't. What's that? How? None of those apps, I'm sure. Really? Show me. I believe you. I've been asking you to show me. Oh, show me what notes you've taken so far. Have you taken notes before? All right, just share them with me when you're done. All right, it better only be notes. There's nothing but note taking going on right now. Okay, so the poor YouTube video people are like, what? What's he doing? You just spent like a whole minute just getting started. Yes. All right, so we talked. What we're basically doing in this week is we're shifting over to Asia to look at. All right, we looked at medieval times in Europe, but you don't have anything like that going on in the Asian countries. And to call them countries is actually probably a bad way to talk about them. Write this word down on the top of your paper. The word is nationalism. When we talk about nationalism, really people today, when we think about history, people think in nationalities. But people, like I said, like I told you before, when it came to the Renaissance, people that lived in Italy would not have necessarily thought of themselves as Italian. People that lived in what we think of as Germany definitely would not have thought of themselves as German. The sense of being a nation, a group of people that have a common history, language, and all that kind of stuff, doesn't develop until after the 1700s. So when you talk about China as being a country, yeah, sort of, but not in the way that everybody in there thought of themselves as Chinese. Or sometimes people find it strange, for instance, in the history that we talk about, when countries, England or France or whatever, can get ruled by somebody from another country and nobody really gets that upset. I mean, when the English later bring in William and Mary, their king and queen, they bring them in from the Netherlands. They're not even English, but it's really not a big deal. They're not thinking in the way that we think about nationalities, about people with a common language and history. So when we talk about China, we're not talking about the China that we talk about today in the same way. It's similar, but so what were these dynasties? Now, the dynasties are basically, what is a dynasty? I'll talk about that in a second. But let's talk about China. Maybe Chris will help me out on this. So we're going to look at this in different phases. First off, the Ming Dynasty. We'll talk a little bit about Confucianism and Zheng He. The Qing Dynasty, which gives the name to modern China. And do I have a third part in there? No, just those two parts. So what exactly is a dynasty? Let's start off with that. That's something to get. I mean, it's different than a kingdom. It's different than a country. What do we mean, Chris? Yeah, a family of rulers. And the thing about China at that time was that if your family could take power, you could run the country. And there were different dynasties made up of people who wouldn't even think of themselves as Chinese and who would admit, we are not Chinese. We just happen to rule the empire of China. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about these dynasties. First off, we have the Ming Dynasty. Now, there were ones before this. We're kind of picking this up around the 1300s. Now, before you had the Yuan Dynasty, made up of people who were ethnically like Mongolia. Oh, this is that thing it did last time. Did this. And it comes back. Okay, so the Mongols are basically, at that time, were a group of nomadic people who lived on the plains north of China. This is eventually the group of people that are the reason you get the Great Wall. Oh my. There you go. Okay, sorry. So you have the Yuan. So they were ethnically Mongol, They come in, they basically grab power from the previous group that's ruling, but eventually they decline. So Hongwu was a Chinese peasant. He leads a rebellion against the Yuan dynasty, and he takes power as emperor. So he's going to start the Ming dynasty. They ruled China for about 300 years. So, and this is not that it's like a minor dynasty, but China's had, handfuls of dynasties that have, it's important to keep it in perspective, ruled China longer than the United States has even been around. So what did they emphasize? And as you'll find with many ruling parties, and also in China in particular, they're going to emphasize stability, order, and peace. So change, innovation, experimentation, not really something they're interested in. And when they took power, they replaced all the Mongol government officials with Chinese people. So how do you emphasize stability, order, and peace? Well, you don't want anybody rebelling, so you start to use laws that are harsher on the people. That's one way. You also get the development of something called Confucianism, which is like a religion in some ways, but is not think of as religion, and what Eastern religions are all about. For instance, when we talk about the big three monotheisms, when we talk about Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, the question that people within those are usually struggling is how to get salvation from sin, how to achieve a satisfactory afterlife. Most of those three religions, most people believe in some sort of afterlife with those. How to reconnect man with God, how to bridge the gap of fallen man. Okay, so that's the Western religions. If you talk Eastern religions, mostly what they're talking about is how do people live, I don't want to say in harmony, but more like how do people live a life that is, throw a good way to explain this. God's not as central in Eastern religions. It can be, but it's not. We'll talk about those as we go. So Confucianism is sort of a melding of something like religion, but also a social code. And so the code stressed sincerity, moral virtue, and relationships. Let's talk a little bit about that. For instance, Confucianism might stress relationships between teacher and student, parent and child, emperor and person that was ruled. And so it emphasized that good relationship and emphasized the right way that a teacher was to act toward a student and a student toward a teacher. What it ended up emphasizing is, in a lot of cases, respect for authority. Yeah. And now most people wouldn't have been able to read the Confucian texts, but the people that could interpret it for them. And it was also something that was almost like you didn't need to read it to know about it. A lot of it had to do with etiquette and how to act. So in the English-speaking world, the person was known as Confucius. The Chinese is closer to Gongfuzi. And so that was the country's social code, how you lived and acted. It also, the religious portion of it was a healthy respect for your dead ancestors. And so that was all part of it too. You notice there's really nothing like that in Christianity or Islam in the same way. There's no, you don't pray to your ancestors the way a Confucian might, in a way. Now, when it comes to Buddhism's even more different from the monotheistic religions in that for someone achieving the highest level in that, it ends their life in a way. Well, we'll talk about that more later. Okay, so the Ming Dynasty, lots of economic prosperity, reformed the tax system. They came up with better things for agriculture. Shane's group showed us the terrace system. We look at the American experience with farming is typically flat. I mean, we look at the Great Plains, it's flat land. You carve up the grass and you plant stuff and it grows. But it's hard to farm if you don't have level land. So China had to deal with that, and what they did in many cases was to, terrace the land so you could have flat land and things like that. They also constructed canals. So Chinese artisans were very skilled and had lots of resources available to make things: silk, porcelain, textiles. A lot of these are the things that aren't available to Europeans and what they want to trade for. Now, the Chinese dynasties under the Ming did build a navy. The navy's not the same as what European nations are later going to build, a navy to go take your military and, exert force on somebody. They're not even like the exploration navies that maybe Columbus would have put together. They're not about going out and trying to find trade routes. China is not really interested in trading with countries around it or with Europe because in many cases, China is pretty self-sufficient. They have most of the stuff they want. And to trade with someone who doesn't have anything you want is to kind of like, just not good for you. You don't want to do that. You got good stuff. They don't have anything. They got crap. So you don't want to trade with them. So what was the Chinese Navy under Zheng He all about? It was designed to explore and extract tribute. Basically, they would go to kingdoms around their area, and they would show up and they would say, greetings from the great Ming Emperor of China. We're here, to welcome you if you want to join us. And in many cases, it was designed to they would pay tribute, a little bit of money or a gift or something that would sort of show their allegiance to China. This went on from 1408 to 1433. And they explored around the regions, but eventually these stopped. Yeah, I mean, your option basically is, and it's to try to, China is big. I mean, China is really in that region, the United States of the day. They can throw their weight around and create tough times for anybody. So those countries often would say, a little bit of a gift. And the gift was often, it's not going to create a lot of wealth either. It might be something symbolic. Like, I think they said that some of the African nations would make gifts of some of the local animals that would just be sort of crazy exotic to the Chinese. And, it's more symbolic than anything else. But it's a sign that, we not that you're like, those countries wouldn't have to, be ruled by China, but they were showing, oh, yes, you are great, basically. So it goes all around the Indian Ocean, Persian Gulf, Arabia, Eastern Africa. But the problem is like I just said, they're not making any money. They're not designed to make money, really. They're costing a lot of money. So eventually the emperors decided that this really wasn't, these naval expeditions were kind of pointless. They were expensive. They ended up costing more than they brought in. Trading is considered a fairly lowly job for the Chinese, especially among the Confucians. And you've also got the fact that there's raiders in the north who are constantly raiding into your country. So it becomes more worthwhile to China to have a powerful land army than it is to have a navy. So that's one of the choices they decide to make. And eventually they're going to get rid of that Chinese navy. Zheng He, by the way, was a eunuch. Anybody familiar with what has happened to a eunuch? No? A eunuch is a man who's had his testicles cut off. Usually in childhood. No, that's what a eunuch is. Believe it or not, although that's pretty gruesome, somebody like Zheng He as a eunuch could become pretty powerful because the reason they would cut off the testicles was to prevent someone who was close to women within the imperial dynasty from being able to actually reproduce with them. So usually that's what had to happen if you wanted to be a high government official. So, but that usually happened at a young age. So yeah, interesting trade-off. Anyway, so let's move on quick. They moved the capital. They moved it north to better defend against the Mongols. They constructed the Forbidden City. This was a city set aside solely for the emperor and his family. The idea was create barriers between the emperor and the people in ways that we typically do with leadership. It might, but just killing the emperor probably isn't enough. You've got to do. Yeah, but you've still got to. You've got to build support that you can actually seize power and hold on to it. You could kill a bunch of people, but then they're ready with, But that could do it. That's one way, one strategy. Yeah, they may not have thought it out as extensively as the Constitution does, and who then becomes president. But right. So the Forbidden City, you couldn't go in unless you were part of the emperor and his advisors. The problem with this is, and this is another place where the Chinese spend extravagantly, very expensive. And in a lot of cases, what happened is the emperors, because they were set aside from the people in the country, they often weren't exposed to a lot of the problems that they were supposed to be fixing as emperors. You okay, Harold? Make sure you're taking notes, okay? Okay. Eventually, you get what you get with these dynasties. Eventually, they decline because they become sort of satisfied, because they start to turn away from governing their people. The government eventually weakens, and it leads to an invasion by another group who's ready to take power. So, like I was saying with Chris, it's not necessarily enough to just kill everybody in the imperial family. That might be enough, but you also, if you have any ambitions to seize power, you better be able to back it up with some muscle, so to speak. And this is the Qing dynasty. They're going to rule China until 1850, and that's eventually going to. I mean, this takes us from really 1600 all the way up to 1850s. So the Manchu were another group of people. They conquered China. They set up the Qing dynasty. They adopted a lot of Chinese customs, but they were not Chinese. They already were Confucianists. They put their own people in positions of power to oversee the Chinese. Now, in addition to just running the country, they also changed some things culturally. They often, style of dress or how you even wear your hair can be a mark of where your allegiances are. So the king ordered that all Chinese had to adopt what was called the queue, which is basically the entire head is bald, and then at the back the hair is grown long into basically like a ponytail. You didn't, then you were put to death, basically. It's a sign of allegiance, really. It's a sign. It's a cultural thing that the Manchus wanted them to do, and it's if the government basically what they're asking you to do is to conform to their idea of how you should dress, and if you can get people to do this, then you can rule them effectively. And anybody who's going to, this is also a way to root out people who might mess with your rule, is if they're going to step out of line enough to, not cut their hair the way you want them to, they might step out of line in bigger ways. So it helps you eliminate some of the people that might, So the idea is to try to bring you into conformity. Yeah. Now, I don't know about the records of those that didn't. It really offends. Anytime we talk about this, or we talk about Peter the Great's beard tax, it always patently offends American kids, because we have, as Americans, this inbuilt sense of, I'm expressing my individuality. Who are you to tell me how to cut my hair? But when it comes to that kind of freedom, that is historically the exception. That's strange compared to what's going on in these countries in those times. So good. Do what? Well, depending on religious beliefs, people may or may not. But I don't know of any countries that are enforcing. Well, maybe Saudi Arabia. We'll have to look into that. Later, we'll talk about Peter the Great's beard tax. The economy was incredibly exciting and grew fast. Okay, so again, even though we're talking about lots of positive innovations by these countries, you shouldn't get the impression that all of a sudden everybody was happy. If you're talking China, most people are living as farmers, peasant farmers. The problem is that when you are a farming family and you have kids, if you try to split up the land among the people in the family, eventually you get smaller and smaller parcels of land split up among the male members of the family. So China was often forced to come up with technological ways to keep the land productive. Wheelbarrows, water pumps for irrigation. Some people also turned to producing cash crops such as silk, other textiles. But most Chinese farming relied on human muscle power, which is called labor-intensive farming. The Qing dynasty was, even though traders were often looked down upon, you still had lots of good trade in China, but not so much out of China, mostly just within China. Okay, so Marco Polo, the famous mythological Marco Polo, turned into a game you play in the pool. All right, so He is said to have spent time over in China, brings back tales of China's arts and riches. And this is really what, in many ways, or at least Marco Polo's stories, are what inspire Europeans to try to get to China. If you had talked about what was the center of the world in that time, what was the ultimate in terms of empires, it really was the Chinese. And so those European countries want to try to get there and trade for the things that China has. Initially, the Chinese refused to trade with the Europeans. That's going to change over time. For a couple centuries, when we hit the 1850s or so, it's really going to get crazy. And but we'll talk about that a little bit later. You've also got the influence of Christianity in China. So Catholic Jesuits, who are a branch of, well, more like an order of Catholicism, discovered the Chinese were not Christian. And the tricky thing about, if you're a Catholic priest, about converting someone who's Jewish or Muslim is that they already worship the same God, but you're trying to convince them that you've got the right way to worship that same God. When the Christians arrive in China, they don't have a God to contend with. Confucianism doesn't have a God, neither does Buddhism. Trying to think of what else might have trickled into China at that point. So in many cases, there were lots of people who converted to Christianity. But over time, the Chinese government eventually began to worry that since Christianity doesn't really emphasize respect for elders necessarily in the same way Confucianism does, or respect for authority, that eventually they kicked the missionaries out of the country. Okay, they get the same problems that basically all the other dynasties have had. The government increases taxes. High-ranking officials use up all the money on stuff that's not really for the country. And eventually the government weakens. Also, the fact is that by the 1850s, European countries are starting to show up and are starting to sort of enforce their trade demands on the Chinese. And they're going to decline too. But we'll come back to that a little bit later. Okay. Cool. All right, we'll call it 4 minutes to look. How many multiple choice questions are there? 3? All right, we'll make it 4 minutes.